It should have been the night he made history. Instead, it became the night that tried to erase him. Malik Thompson had spent the last 6 months living out of a battered suitcase, hopping between smoky jazz clubs from New Orleans to Chicago, his trumpet singing in places that rarely saw a black man on stage unless he was playing for tips. But tonight was different tonight. The ticket in his breast pocket was his passport to the biggest stage of his life, a music festival in Paris that promised to launch him into the stratosphere. He'd barely slept the night before. Not because of nerves he'd been playing in front of judgmental, whiskey-soaked audiences since he was 16, but because his mama had called, her voice trembling in that way that told him she was proud but afraid. "Baby," she said, "you play your heart out, you hear? And you make them remember your name." It was 7:15 p.m. at JFK Airport, Terminal 4, and the place was humming with the restless chaos of travel. Flight boards clicked, announcing cities that seemed like whispers of another life. London, Rome, Madrid. Malik stood in line at the customs checkpoint, his trumpet case dangling from his left hand, his heart keeping time with the muted thump of his foot. That's when he saw him. Officer Gerald Whitford. Mid-40s. Clean cut. The kind of jawline you only saw in old war recruitment posters. His uniform was pressed so sharply it could cut paper. And his eyes cold, scanning, calculating, landed on Malik like a spotlight that wasn't there to illuminate, but to burn. "Next," Whitford barked. Malik stepped forward, slid his ticket and passport across the counter, offering the polite nod he'd been taught to give to authority figures who already didn't want him there. Whitford didn't nod back. His gaze flicked from the passport photo to Malik's face, then lingered on the trumpet case. "What's in the bag?" "A trumpet," Malik said evenly. "Open it." Malik hesitated only a second before unlatching the case. Inside, the polished brass gleamed under the harsh fluorescent lights. He could almost feel it breathing, waiting to sing again. Whitford's lip curled. "You a musician?" "Yes, sir." "Heading to Paris?" "That's right." "Playing at?" "Not anymore, you're not." The words hit harder than a cymbal crash. Malik blinked. "Excuse me." Whitford slid the ticket back toward him, now stamped in thick black ink. "Cancelled." "I have reason to believe this trip isn't legitimate," Whitford said, his tone sharp with an authority that thrived on being unquestioned. "We've had incidents. People smuggling contraband and musical instruments. You'll have to rebook once you've been cleared." Behind Malik, a businessman shifted impatiently. Someone muttered about missing a connection, but all Malik could hear was the deafening sound of his chance slipping away. He forced himself to breathe. "Officer, I've got documentation from the festival, letters from the organizers, even a—" Whitford cut him off with a raised hand. "Not my problem." It was the smirk that did it. That small, poisonous curl of the lips that said, "I can take this from you, and you can't stop me." The anger rose in Malik's chest like a trumpet swell before the chorus, but he knew the rules drilled into him by his father, who'd once been dragged from his own car for asking a cop why he was stopped. Never give them an excuse. So Malik stepped aside, heart hammering, mind spinning through options. The festival would start in less than 48 hours. Missing his flight tonight meant missing everything. He pulled out a payphone card and called the festival coordinator in Paris, a fast-talking Frenchman named Alain Duval. "Mon Dieu," Alain breathed when Malik explained. "This is outrageous. We will call the embassy, the airline." But time, Malik knew, was an enemy that didn't take sides. That's when a voice behind him said, "They do this all the time." He turned to see a tall woman with a mane of auburn hair and a leather camera bag slung over her shoulder. "Name's Claire," she said. "I'm with the Village Voice. I've been photographing the airport for a piece on travel restrictions. Saw the whole thing." Her words landed like a lifeline. "You got pictures?" Malik asked. "Plenty," she said. "And if Whitford's done this to you, I'd bet money you're not the first." Malik hesitated. He wasn't the kind to make a fuss, at least, not offstage. But the humiliation still burned, searing itself into a place he'd tried to protect his whole life. "Help me," he said finally. Over the next hour, Claire worked with the quiet precision of someone who'd made a career out of catching the truth in frames. She talked to airport staff, passengers, anyone who'd seen the exchange. And slowly, a picture emerged. Whitford had a history. Several black and brown passengers had reported random cancellations or security delays that cost them flights, jobs, reunions. Complaints were filed and buried. By midnight, Malik was sitting in a dim diner across from Claire, a stack of notes and photos between them. The smell of burnt coffee and fried onions hung in the air. "This could blow up," she said. "Not just your story, all of it. But you have to be ready for what comes with that." Malik thought about Paris, about the music that had kept him alive when nothing else could, about his mama's trembling voice telling him to make them remember his name. He met Claire's gaze. "I'm ready." The plan formed almost without either of them saying it aloud. Claire had contacts at the Village Voice and other papers. Malik had the story in the face that could ignite the conversation. All they needed was proof so undeniable that even the most skeptical editor couldn't ignore it. 2 days. That's all the festival window allowed. If Malik couldn't get on a plane by then, Paris was gone. But Claire argued this wasn't just about a gig anymore. "This," she said, tapping the table for emphasis, "is about the fact that a man in uniform can strip your future away because of the color of your skin and get away with it." Malik didn't disagree, but the urgency in his bones was still there, gnawing at him like a restless bass line. "If we do this," he said, "we do it fast." They left the diner just past 1 a.m., the city humming with that restless New York energy that didn't sleep, just changed shifts. Outside, the streetlights cast long shadows, turning the rain-slicked pavement into a mirror of the night sky. Claire led him to her car, a beat-up Chevy Nova with the passenger seat permanently stuck too far back, and they headed to her apartment in the East Village. It was the kind of place where the walls were lined with books and photographs, each one a frozen moment in someone else's story. She spread the prints from her camera on the kitchen table, Whitford mid-smirk, Whitford stamping the ticket, Whitford ignoring Malik's documentation. But the most damning was the shot where Malik's hands were open, palms out, while Whitford leaned forward with a glare that dripped contempt. "This is gold," she said. "But we can't just run with your story. We need patterns. Names. Dates." Malik rubbed his eyes. "How do we get that?" "Official complaints," she said simply. "They're public record if you know where to look." The next morning, Claire called in a favor from a friend at the Port Authority's records department. Within hours, they had a folder thin but telling. 5 formal complaints over the past 3 years, all from passengers of color, all naming Officer Gerald Whitford. 3 alleged racial remarks. 2 mentioned canceled tickets with no refund. None had resulted in disciplinary action. Malik flipped through the pages, his chest tightening. He saw his own story reflected in the words of strangers, different faces, same treatment. They needed more. So they went back to JFK that afternoon. Malik, in a cap and sunglasses, stayed in the background while Claire hung around the security checkpoint with her camera at the ready. It didn't take long. A young Dominican couple, speaking rapid Spanish, were pulled aside by Whitford. Malik watched the familiar dance, questions that didn't need asking, glances toward luggage, the slow shake of the head. The couple's smiles faded into the same frustrated disbelief he'd felt less than 24 hours ago. Claire's shutter clicked quietly from a distance. When Whitford finally let them go, boarding passes now useless, Malik approached. "Excuse me," he said softly. "Did he cancel your tickets?" The man's shoulders slumped. "Said we needed extra clearance. Flight's gone now. Has this ever happened to you before?" The woman nodded. "Once. Miami. But this time," she trailed off, her eyes narrowing. "Why are you asking?" "Because it happened to me yesterday," Malik said. "And I think it's happening to a lot of us." He gave them Claire's card. The woman tucked it into her purse like it was something fragile. By nightfall, Claire's kitchen table was buried under a growing collection of testimonies, photographs, and copies of complaint forms. Malik stared at it all, the weight of it pressing against his ribs. This wasn't just his fight anymore. But the clock was still ticking. Alain called again from Paris, his voice taut with worry. "Mon ami, I am trying. But the festival will not hold the slot forever. There is a replacement ready." Malik closed his eyes. "Give me 1 more day." "1 more day," Alain said reluctantly. "After that, it is over." The next morning, Claire pitched the story to her editor at the Village Voice. His first reaction was hesitation, libel, legal pushback, the usual dance. But then she sent over the photographs, and the complaint records, and the names of passengers willing to speak on the record. Within an hour, the green light came through. It wasn't just the Village Voice, either. A friend at the Amsterdam News wanted in. A local radio host Malik had met once offered airtime. Word started spreading through Harlem's jazz circles, then the wider black community. By the evening, Malik found himself sitting in a cramped studio across from a DJ with a velvet-smooth voice. "We're here with Malik Thompson," the DJ said into the mic. "A young brother who's making headlines for all the wrong reasons, not because of something he did, but something done to him." "Malik, tell them what happened." Malik spoke slowly at first, then with growing certainty. He described the smirk, the stamp, the cold dismissal. He talked about the others he'd met in just the past 2 days. And when the DJ asked what he wanted, Malik didn't hesitate. "I want to make sure no one else loses their shot because of a man like that. And I want to get to Paris not just for me, but for everyone who's been told they can't." Whitford, of course, heard about it. By Friday morning, the New York Post ran a small but biting headline: "JFK officer accused of racist ticket cancellations." It wasn't front-page news yet, but it was enough to make Whitford storm into the Port Authority office demanding to know who'd been running their mouth. An internal memo went out that afternoon reminding officers to adhere to protocol at all times. Whitford's supervisor, a man named Captain Rollins, pulled him aside. "You're under a microscope now," Rollins warned. Whitford shrugged it off. "Just noise. It'll blow over." But it didn't. By Friday evening, Claire's article dropped online, accompanied by a photo of Malik standing in the terminal, trumpet case in hand, framed against the chaos of the airport. The piece laid out the history, the complaints, and the human cost, including the festival slots slipping through Malik's fingers. The comments exploded. Musicians, travelers, and everyday readers weighed in. Some shared their own airport stories. Others demanded Whitford's firing. A few tried to downplay it, but they were drowned out by the tide of voices calling for accountability. Malik's phone didn't stop ringing. Alan called again. The festival board saw the article. "They are furious not at you, at what happened. If you can get here by Sunday, the slot is yours." It was Saturday morning. Claire grinned when Malik told her. "Then we've got one last play." She marched into the Port Authority office that afternoon with Malik beside her. A local TV crew was already there, tipped off by the papers. Claire's camera hung around her neck like an extra set of eyes. At the front desk, she asked for Captain Rollins. When he appeared, she handed him a thick manila folder, the photographs, the testimonies, the complaint records, all organized and copied. "This," she said loudly enough for the cameras to hear, "is the evidence that one of your officers has been racially profiling and canceling tickets without cause. This man," she pointed to Malik, "has lost time, money, and nearly his career because of it. We're asking for immediate clearance for him to board tonight's flight to Paris and a public statement about how you're going to fix this." Rollins' jaw tightened. The cameras were rolling. The weight of the moment hung in the stale office air. He glanced at Malik, then at the file, then back at the cameras. "We'll review the matter," he said stiffly. Claire didn't move. "No, you'll act. Right now." For a long, dangerous second, Malik thought Rollins would refuse. But then a man from the airline's international desk stepped forward. "Sir," he said to Rollins, "we can reissue the ticket. It's within policy, given the circumstances." Rollins gave a curt nod. "Fine. Issue it." Malik's hands shook slightly as the new boarding pass slid across the counter toward him. "Tonight, 9:45 p.m., direct to Paris." He wanted to cheer, to let the relief spill out in laughter, but there was still Whitford. And Whitford wasn't done. As Malik and Claire turned to leave, Whitford emerged from the side hall. His eyes locked on Malik's. "You think you've won something?" he said quietly. Malik met his gaze. "No, I know I have." At the gate that evening, Malik stood by the window, watching the sun dip behind the horizon, the sky streaked in deep orange and purple. Claire was there too, snapping one last photo, Malik silhouetted against the plane that would carry him toward his dream. "You'll play Paris," she said. "But when you come back, we're not done." He nodded. "When I come back, we finish this." The boarding call echoed through the terminal. Malik picked up his trumpet case, took a deep breath, and stepped toward the gate, not just as a musician chasing a dream, but as a man who'd refused to let someone steal his name from the music. The hum of the jet engines felt like the steady thrum of a bass beneath Malik's feet. For the first time in 3 days, he allowed himself to close his eyes and breathe. His seat was cramped, the cabin air stale, but he didn't care. In just over 7 hours, he'd be stepping onto Parisian soil, trumpet in hand. But even as he drifted toward sleep, the memory of Whitford's smirk still hovered like an unresolved chord. Claire's words before boarding replayed in his head. "When you come back, we finish this." Paris greeted him with a sharp winter wind and a sky the color of pewter. Alain was waiting at Charles de Gaulle Airport, his scarf whipping in the breeze, his expression a mix of relief and disbelief. "Mon frère," he exclaimed, pulling Malik into a quick embrace. "You made it." "Barely," Malik said with a tired smile. "No time to rest," Alain warned, ushering him toward a waiting car. "Your sound check is in 2 hours. Tonight, the Salle Pleyel will be full." The venue was everything Malik had dreamed: grand, with high ceilings and warm acoustics that seemed to carry even a whispered note into eternity. As he unpacked his trumpet, the weight of the past week melted just enough for excitement to take its place. The festival lineup was stacked with talent from around the world, but word had spread about the American musician who almost didn't make it. Musicians he'd never met offered firm handshakes, some with knowing nods that said they understood exactly what he'd been through. When the lights dimmed and the announcer introduced him, Malik stepped into the spotlight like he'd been doing it his whole life. The first note poured from his trumpet warm and full, swelling until it filled every inch of the hall. He played with fire, with grief, with defiance. Every run and bend of a note was a refusal to be silenced. The crowd was silent during the ballads, roaring after the up-tempo numbers, but Malik barely heard them. He was somewhere else entirely, a place where Whitford's stamp could never reach. By the final number, the audience was on its feet. Alain met him backstage afterward, grinning ear to ear. "You've just made Paris yours," he said. The next morning, Paris newspapers ran reviews that bordered on reverent. But back in New York, another kind of headline was making waves. Claire's follow-up piece had dropped, and this time, it wasn't just about Malik. She'd tracked down 3 more passengers from past incidents, each willing to go on camera. One was an elderly black woman who'd missed her granddaughter's wedding because Whitford had, randomly, pulled her aside. Another was a Kenyan professor denied boarding for a conference keynote. Their testimonies were raw, unflinching, and impossible to dismiss. The story snowballed. National papers picked it up. Civil rights organizations began calling for a formal investigation into JFK's customs practices. By the third night of the festival, Malik's set was being broadcast on a French radio station and simultaneously streamed back in Harlem bars where his friends and neighbors gathered to listen. Claire called him after the show, her voice buzzing with adrenaline. "They've put Whitford on administrative leave," she said, "without pay. And the Port Authority just announced they're launching a full review." Malik leaned against the dressing room wall, letting the words sink in. "That's a start." "It's more than a start," Claire insisted. "You're the reason they can't sweep it under the rug this time." When Malik returned to New York a week later, it was different from when he'd left. At JFK, instead of suspicious stares, he was met by a small crowd: journalists, supporters, fellow musicians holding up signs that read "Justice at JFK" and "Stop the Profiling." Claire was there too, camera in hand. "Welcome home," she said. "Feels like it," he replied. They didn't waste time. Malik agreed to testify at the Port Authority's public hearing. The room was packed: reporters along the back wall, community members in folding chairs, and a line of officers in crisp uniforms along one side. Whitford wasn't there, but his absence didn't make the air any less charged. When it was Malik's turn, he stepped up to the microphone, the same way he stepped up to a bandstand. Steady, ready. He told them everything: the canceled ticket, the smirk, the others he'd met. He didn't raise his voice, but every word landed like a note struck true. "This isn't about one man," he said, scanning the faces in front of him. "It's about a system that lets people in power take from you just because they can. I'm standing here because I had help, but a lot of people don't." The room was silent for a beat after he finished, then erupted in applause. The investigation's findings were damning. Whitford had engaged in consistent and targeted misuse of authority, disproportionately affecting passengers of color. Several of his decisions had violated Port Authority guidelines outright. The final recommendation: termination. When the news broke, Whitford tried to mount a defense, claiming he'd acted in the interest of safety and that the accusations were politically motivated. But the evidence: Claire's photos, the testimonies, the complaint records dismantled his case. He was fired within the month. In the weeks that followed, the Port Authority introduced new oversight measures, independent review boards for passenger complaints, mandatory bias training, and random audits of customs decisions. It wasn't perfect. Malik knew systems didn't change overnight, but it was more than there had been before. One evening, a few months later, Malik and Claire met at a Harlem club. She'd just come from an exhibit opening. He'd just finished a rehearsal. "You know," she said, sipping her drink, "you could have just gone to Paris, played your set, and left it all behind." "Could have," Malik agreed. "But then I'd have been part of the silence." She smiled. "You're a hell of a lot louder now." On stage that night, Malik played a new composition, slow, aching, then building into something fierce and unstoppable. He called it Gate Number 4. The crowd didn't need the backstory to feel its power. For Malik, it was the sound of a door slammed in his face and the music he'd made while kicking it back open. The months rolled on, but the ripples from the JFK incident didn't fade. If anything, they widened. Musicians from across the country began sharing their own travel stories, canceled tickets, random searches, lost opportunities. Some were jazz veterans who'd been touring since before Malik was born. Others were young kids just starting out. The common thread was the quiet humiliation they'd all carried in silence, until Malik's story gave them permission to speak. One evening, Malik was invited to speak at the Schomburg Center in Harlem. The auditorium was full not just of music fans, but of activists, students, and elders who'd fought their own battles with discrimination. He spoke for nearly an hour, weaving his personal story into a broader truth about art, dignity, and resilience. When he finished, an older man in the front row stood and raised his voice. "You made them hear you, son. That's all we've ever wanted to be heard." Meanwhile, Whitford's name didn't vanish as quickly as he might have hoped. His dismissal was public, and though he tried to pivot into private security work, most employers didn't want the baggage that came with him. Local papers reported he'd moved upstate, taking odd jobs to keep afloat. Claire once showed Malik a photo someone had snapped Whitford in a flannel shirt, working behind the counter of a hardware store. Malik looked at it for a long moment, then set it down. "Doesn't change what he did," Malik said. "But I guess that's part of the price." The Village Voice nominated Claire's coverage for a journalism award. When the ceremony came, she insisted Malik attend with her. They sat side by side in a room full of reporters and editors, listening as the host read out the nominees. When Claire's name was announced as the winner, the applause was loud enough to shake the walls. She stood, accepted the award, and to Malik's surprise handed the microphone to him. "This is his story," she said simply. Malik stepped forward, clearing his throat. "I'm a musician, not a journalist," he began. "But I know a good story when I hear one. And this one, it's not about me. It's about what happens when the truth gets its moment in the spotlight and what we do with it after." In the years that followed, Malik's career soared. Paris had been the spark, but the fire spread invitations to festivals in Tokyo, London, Cape Town. His records began to sell beyond the jazz niche, finding audiences who connected with the emotion behind every note. But he never stopped talking about what happened in 1978. At every major show, he'd tell the crowd about the night at JFK, about the ticket, about the smirk. Sometimes the story was met with gasps, other times, with nods from those who knew the feeling too well. And always, he ended it with the same line. "They tried to take the music from me. Instead, they gave me a louder song." 10 years later, in 1988, Malik was invited back to the Salle Pleyel in Paris, the same hall where he'd made his breakthrough. Alain was still running the festival, a little grayer now, but no less animated. "I saved you the closing slot," Alain said with a grin. "You always close strong." That night, Malik played with a kind of freedom he couldn't have imagined a decade earlier. The music was richer, the silences between notes more deliberate, as though every breath carried its own story. Backstage afterward, Alain handed him a letter that had arrived from New York. The handwriting was sharp, deliberate. It was from Whitford. The letter was short. Whitford wrote that he'd been following Malik's career from a distance and had seen the Paris performance broadcast on television. He admitted that what he'd done was wrong, that at the time he'd told himself he was just doing his job, but in truth he'd been acting out of prejudice he hadn't wanted to face. He ended with, "You probably won't care, but I'm sorry. I see now what I took from you and what you refused to let me keep." Malik folded the letter carefully, and slipped it into his trumpet case. He didn't write back. Some things didn't need answers. By the 1990s, the Port Authority's reforms had become a model for other airports. Bias training was expanded, oversight boards were standard, and complaints no longer vanished into filing cabinets. It was far from perfect, but Malik knew countless travelers had made it to their destinations because of those changes. One night, after a gig at the Blue Note in Manhattan, a young black saxophonist approached him. "Mr. Thompson," the kid said, "I just wanted to say I flew out of JFK last month, no problems. My mom told me your story. She says I probably have you to thank." Malik smiled. "You don't owe me thanks. Just keep playing. That's how we all win." In 2008, 30 years after Paris, Malik retired from touring. But he never stopped playing small clubs, community events, even street corners in Harlem when the mood struck. Claire still came by often, camera in hand, though she'd long since moved from breaking news to documentary work. One summer evening, they sat on the stoop outside Malik's brownstone, the hum of the city around them. "You ever think about that night at JFK?" Claire asked. "All the time," Malik said. "Not with anger, not anymore. But I think about how close I came to letting it break me, and how lucky I was that you were there with that camera." She nudged him with her shoulder. "Lucky works both ways, you know." In 2018, the Schomburg Center hosted an exhibition titled Gate Number 4, Music, Justice, and the Journey of Malik Thompson. It featured photographs from Claire's archives, press clippings from the investigation, and in a glass case the original canceled ticket, stamped in thick black ink. At the opening, Malik stood before the display, trumpet in hand, surrounded by family, friends, and strangers who knew his story. He raised the horn to his lips and played a slow, haunting melody that bled into a triumphant refrain. When the last note hung in the air, the room erupted in applause. Later that night, Malik found himself alone in the gallery. He looked at the ticket one last time. Once, it had been the symbol of a dream stolen. Now, it was proof of something larger, that even when the gate is slammed shut, the music can find another way through. He smiled, turned, and walked toward the exit. Outside, the city was alive, the air thick with the sound of sirens, laughter, and far-off music. Somewhere, someone was playing. And Malik knew as long as the music was alive, so was the fight. Thank you for listening. If you find it interesting, please like and subscribe to follow the next stories.